So our first speaker is Nick Kemp. Nick was formerly Glasgow City Council's Head of Service for Older People and has written and spoken about the future of residential care in Scotland.
Hello, everybody, and thanks very much for inviting me to speak. I'm now a campaigner on care. I no longer work in the sector. I did have some connections with Edinburgh and indeed came over and saw care homes in Edinburgh 10 years ago, so I know a little about what's happened. I'm going to try and put this into a sort of wider context of what's happening in care and local authority care. So I'd like to just start. I mean, everyone will know there's been a long history of outsourcing of care since basically the Tory government under Margaret Thatcher, and more specifically then John Major, and there was a great push to bring the private sector into care. And then since then, because of lack of resources, local authorities have been under pressure to make savings, so more and more care has been outsourced, and there's now very little public sector care home provision left in Scotland. And I think that's really important. It's really, really important that we keep that public sector provision. And the single most important reason for that, I think, is about the workforce. Workforce is absolutely key to the quality of care in future. The only part of the workforce that is properly paid and rewarded and has decent terms and conditions are those employed by local authorities. The private sector is atrocious, where there's lots of problems we can talk about there about precarious working, but what we keep in Scotland examples to show that things can be different, that we don't need to have that sort of private care home system, that local authorities could do it, is absolutely essential. The key part of this closure, when the Edinburgh Integrated Joint Board looked at it, they haven't considered that at all, right? They haven't considered anything about the need for them to stay in, to set an example of how care could be, how it could be alternative. Instead, what they've done is they've just proposed basically that half of that, the remaining local authority provision, should go. And I think that's a really, really serious issue. And actually, if you're wanting to see the way they're going, in the report to the Integrated Joint Board, they actually have two other homes, and people will know that where they built the homes. I actually went to see one of them 10 years ago. They then outsourced the provision of care there. I think it was to Four Seasons who provided the care. Those contracts are up next year. But instead of putting that within the context and saying, and maybe that some of their existing homes aren't fit for purpose, but instead of saying we'll take back the good buildings, we'll bring that back into Edinburgh Council so we can use that to exemplify how we could treat the workforce properly. Instead of doing that, they've said we'll have a separate procurement and commissioning strategy to look about whether we're going to re-tender those homes, right? So the people who are driving this are completely dedicated, as I can see it, to outsource. They have no interest in retaining local authority care, and that is just incredibly important. And I'd just like to also comment here, and I think there's a subtext to this, because I commented publicly on Drumbray Care Home a year ago. Now, most of you know this is an Edinburgh City Council home, and it was arguably the worst care home in Scotland. I mean, and it stayed with grades, that absolutely appalling grades, for over a year. And it was eventually, just before the COVID crisis, issued with an improvement notice. And that was after what I couldn't understand, having been a manager. And I used to have a team of people looking after Glasgow's care homes. If the slightest thing went wrong in one of those care homes, people were on to me saying, we've got to fix this, right? There was a public sector ethos that said the slightest thing that the care inspectorate found wrong with their homes, we were in there dealing with it, right? And what I reflect on is, how has it come that actually in Edinburgh City Council, that the managers allowed this situation to go on for so long? And part of, if you read the care inspectorate reports, despite jobs being well paid, they had massive staff turnover there. That was one of the problems. And obviously something was going very wrong with management. Now, the subtext around this is you just have to wonder whether the managers in the IJB responsible for this. It just appears they don't have the interest or the capability of managing public sector care properly. And I think that's something you need to think about. The second thing that I'd like to talk about is just how this fits in, because after the COVID crisis, which is very much from the crisis in the care homes in the private sector, was absolutely immense. And I've written about how predictable it was. Staff haven't been trained, they weren't prepared for infection control and so on. And what came out of that then was pressure to have an alternative. And the government has, and Scottish government announced that it would look at setting up a national care service. And as part of that, it set up the adult care review under Derek Feely. Now, it made certain recommendations, and I think that's really quite important for what's happening here. First of all, it suggested that commissioning should move from local authorities to these integrated joint boards. That's effectively what's happened here. You can see what's going to happen to the integrated joint boards when commissioning moves there and responsibility for care goes. They will be, with limited budgets, they're going to be faced with a choice, right? Local authority care provision expensive, private sector cheap. What will happen? They will inevitably, right, they will cut off contracts with all local authority homes. And I think what's happened, and home care services and so on, because they won't be able to afford it. And actually the other thing about the Feely review is it doesn't deal with the question of what resources are needed for proper care. So the whole model of a national care service that we're going down on is actually going to further outsourcing in future. Rather than solve the problems, rather than have a not-for-profit care service where money is reinvested in care, we're going to end up down the current system. And actually the IJB report just reflects that. It reflects a couple of other things which I think are really seriously wrong about the Feely review. One of them is what I would say a management approach. Feely came from the Institute of Healthcare Improvement in the United States after running services here. It's all about what's called improvement science. That's all top down, managers know best. The report to the IJB was very much like that. And there's no need to consult relatives or unions or anything else, because actually what we want is a technocratic fix to the problems in care, rather than opening it up for public debate and discussion and involvement. So I think there's quite a lot of things about this which reflect the way that Scotland's going and why the National Care Service that people are talking about at the moment isn't fit for purpose. The third thing I'd just like to say here, and it's about having a vision for the future. After the COVID crisis, I would say that arguably not a single care home in Scotland is fit for purpose, right? What has happened is we have got buildings, and buildings were improved, private sector paid for them according to care standards. But if you see that now those care homes, they don't have sufficient staff and they don't have enough space to care for people safely, to apply good infection control while respecting human rights. And that's very much reflected in the fact that relatives are still being blocked from seeing residents in care homes, right? There's all sorts of problems about it. And it's because our care isn't fit for purpose. Now, what the IJB has just said is, oh, the buildings in Edinburgh aren't fit for purpose. I'm sure that's right, but no building is, right? And instead of having a vision of, actually, we could now demonstrate a different type of care following COVID, we need to be looking at how do we create care homes fit for the future? How can we lead the way? It's like we'll just shut everything down and we'll leave that to the private sector. And this lack of vision is also shown is on the argument about, and they argue that residential care, lower levels of care aren't needed any longer. Well, they could either be employing National Health Service nurses to work in higher levels of care, along with people employed by local authority. So on the one hand, they could be looking at a vision of care homes, building care homes that were doing that sort of thing. Or if they didn't need that, and they talk about more people living in the community, they would need to invest in housing, what's called housing-based models of care. So you would invest in places with like sheltered housing, specially designed to help look after people, so people have their own homes and are cared for there with care teams. But none of those visionary things are part of this proposal at all. It's just about we need to shut the homes. And just to end up on what this links back to, reading the report, is actually it links to what's happened to outsourcing in the NHS. Because of course, what the IJB has got at the moment, what health has got at the moment, is they are linked into PFI contracts that they can't get out of. They're quite open about that in the report. So
There's your 2-minute warning.
Yeah. So they're in this contract, they've outsourced their buildings, they can't get out of it, they're in financial trouble. So what do? Well, we'll just make savings out of local authorities. It's a completely unsustainable strategy. When that finishes, after they've done this closure, there'll be another closure after it. And people actually have to argue for the resources that would make care fit for the purpose. Thanks very much.
Perfect, thank you. That was absolutely wonderful to hear you